The new Japanese tank destroyer is well and truly within World of Tanks, and it is absolutely a monster to be reckoned with. And today we're going to both showcase how you can take this thing out and some ridiculous gameplay where this thing is used to the utmost ability. So stay tuned, because this one is going to be really important to understand how this tank plays and what this tank is all about. So the first match is indeed one of the best matches you're going to see in the Hori 3 for a long time, and this one is really important to understand how you can use this tank and why you don't want to just sit in front of it like the enemy team are doing straight away in this result here. Now of course on Safe Haven you can take this early game position to get into a nice little area where you can both come up against the heavy tanks who are going to be sitting in front of you. Don't quite know why the enemy team decided to do this, obviously working very well against the two Horis, especially with an ammo rack in there on the Object 257 for nearly 2,000 damage. But what's great about these tanks and why I wanted to showcase them today is not necessarily because they're outrageously overpowered and going to somehow be able to dominate an entire flank on their own, since they can be penned by a lot of vehicles, and the armor model, as you can see on screen right now, is not particularly OP or anything like that. It can be penned, of course. It's very flat on the superstructure. It's actually much worse than a Jaegeru in terms of the angling, which makes this tank a little bit of a premium ammo destroyer in terms of it gets penned by basically everything that's loading premium ammunition. But what is great about this tank is that 700 alpha and a reload of about 14 seconds base, which makes this tank fairly quick at being able to reload and pump out and churn out that damage in huge chunks. And when you are using some of the top equipment in the game, you can get that reload down to about 12 seconds, which is pretty good when you consider that 700 alpha and how he's been able to pick up nearly 5,000 damage in this result. And yeah, a really nice one so far. Now from what I understand of the vehicle and from seeing multiple replays of this thing, as we're going to showcase in today's gameplay, and hopefully you'll understand too, is that this tank is very kind of flexible considering how big it is and how much of a chunk this thing really is. And that's because of the fact that the reverse speed seems to be pretty decent. Now it's not anything ridiculous for a slow tank destroyer like you'd expect, but it is somewhat decent, and that allows you to try and side scrape like you're seeing here. Obviously not going all too well, as the round most likely went into the lower plate or the superstructure, which is yeah, definitely into that frontal plate, which is of course not angled because yeah, brilliant tank design. Either way, what we've seen is an aggressive push towards the E75. Now in this central area, it's really key that you remove the tanks out of the game as quickly as possible so you can move on with how you want to play. And the E75 manages to super high roll there for over 600, which is ridiculous. I mean, if I was him, I'd be definitely ordering my lottery ticket, but I guess that's playing World of Tanks and pressing the battle button. But either way, so far picking up 7,000 damage, and the game has only really just begun. I mean, we're 4 minutes in and there is still 12,000 damage to pick up on the enemy team, and that damage is definitely going to be farmed up by the Hori 3. And what I was really surprised about when I saw this tank in action, when you see it in game, is that it just feels like it is quite versatile. I mean, you know, for a non-turreted TD, of course. I'm not going to be saying this is, you know, a medium tank that's able to take all of the positions in the game. It isn't. But for a tank that is supposedly the Japanese version of the Jaegeru, it certainly feels a lot more flexible than the Jaegeru, and you're able to turn quite quickly, you're able to maneuver backwards quite quickly. You can see here up to 25 kilometers an hour backwards, which is really nice. And with the engine power and everything that you get with this vehicle, getting up to the top speed of 35 kilometers an hour is not actually too bad, and it means that you can accelerate away quickly, you can pull back from behind a corner quite quickly, and you can avoid shots of damage that something like a Jaegeru just would not be able to do. And you can see here when you're trying to retreat slowly backwards whilst also being able to cover yourself from tanks that might be trying to poke you, like the Shah Futura and the T-54 lightweight here, you're able to do that without really suffering, you know, being able to be farmed or being caught out from one of your side points. But You can see here there is an M48 and there's a UDES in the central areas. Now they are on the top of the central location, but there is also a Jaeger out and about. And so you don't want to be getting hit by that, especially considering that you are a one-shot potential for the Jaeger, and you don't have anywhere near the alpha of a Jaeger, unfortunately, with only 700 compared to the nearly, well, over 1,000 damage that you can deal with the Jaeger. So you do suffer in that department, but you do get that increased reload, allowing you to get 2,800 base damage per minute. And that allows you to not only deal with opponents because you have the alpha to poke around and deal damage to heavy tanks that don't have that 700, or medium tanks that have 360, 320, you know, the 390. And when you're coming up against tier 8s, you can really easily outtrade the majority of them, even if you are significantly hindered by the amount of hit points that you have over some of those heavy tanks, like things like the E100, the Maus, and some of the Type 5s, etc. This one does indeed have 2,000 hit points, which is okay, and that means that, yeah, you can trade a little bit, and when you have that alpha, it makes trading a lot easier, especially if you do have teammates that you can kind of support in that role where you do come around and try and deal that damage. Now the enemy team, there's a Centurion 7/1, which is the biggest threat on this side of the map. As you know, on Safe Haven, taking the central location is very important, but when you are trying to push with this vehicle, you have to be a little bit careful. But luckily, he gets into a nice position here, which actually somewhat makes the armor of the superstructure angled upwards. And when you do angle your armor upwards, you give yourself that angling that the Jaeger would have. And the armor on this tank is quite nice. And you can see him just pulling back down that ridge, trying to make it difficult for the UDES 16 to get a free shot of damage. And also in this position, you can see him hiding the lower plate. And once again, because the Centurion 7/1 has been removed in the back of the game, it allows him to both shut down the M48 pattern and the UDES and come away with securing the central position. And now, with just the Minotauro and the Jaeger over on this side, Jaeger being much more inflexible allows you to move around and find out the best position for your tank. Now the Minotauro has pushed towards the artillery pieces, the 212A and the 50A, but using the speed, maneuverability, and also the armor in that central location as he took out the UDES 16, this player obviously knows exactly what they're doing with the tank, and so decides it's now time to try and secure some damage on this Minotauro. And he managed to find out where the Minotauro is, and fortunately he's got his ass towards him, and that allows one free shell. He goes for the tracking shot, tracks him in place, and with this tank, because of the fact that you reload pretty quickly, that allows you to try and retrack opponents. And unfortunately he takes one from the Minotauro. Of course, it was a heat round, and heat rounds, like I said in the beginning of this, are the bane of this tank's existence. As you can see, a shell straight into the very, very flat armor of the turret, which sucks, but really, really nice one there. Safe Haven is always an awkward one in this late stage of the battle, because either you've pushed the hill area and you've won it, and now you're pushing down into the town, into tanks like the Jaeger, or potentially some of the heavy tanks who are sat there waiting for you to make that play, or alternatively you've won this side and then you're having to push into the people on the hill if you want to push. So it's kind of gets into a stalemate position where pushing either side is not necessarily the best idea, but either way, they managed to secure the damage in this game, picking up over 13,000 damage and into the next one. Now we've seen what this tank can do in terms of in-game, and we'll watch another replay in just a second, but I want to cover how you can take this thing out, since we've seen the armor model working a little bit where people are just auto-aiming this tank and of course not being able to pen. Now this tank is not necessarily the hardest tank to actually pen, and you'll see here the armor model, although it has a few nuances that you'll be wanting to know, and that is that the lower plate, if you are looking at this tank, is not the place where you want to be hitting it, since it will create an auto ricochet. It's a very, very sloped lower plate, and that means that when you're seeing this in the visual model, you'll be wanting to hit this bar here, not this area down here. And if you do find it up against this thing, you can see just how easy it is to pen this thing straight through here. 120 millimeters of penetration, meaning tier 8 tanks are going to be able to go straight through the hull armor of this vehicle, and that is going to be your best bet if you are playing against this tank and it doesn't manage to get this area hull down. And even if you are coming up against this tank and you're looking at it from this sort of area, you can still pen the upper hull armor of the vehicle, since you need about 230 millimeters to easily do it. Now, as soon as this kind of starts using its gun depression, if it's using its full 7 degrees of gun depression, you cannot actually pen that upper plate. So if you are coming up against this thing and it's on a ridge line, you basically don't want to be aiming at the upper hull armor, and especially if you can't see the lower plate, then you don't want to be aiming here either. And that means that you're going to have to go for the turret armor, and failing that, you are basically screwed, since if you cannot have over 300 pen and it's in this sort of position where it does cover the hull armor, you're basically going to have to leave, or alternatively you have to wait for it to turn slightly and you can pen, much like the Type 5 Heavy has these side weak points. And if you can manage to see this tank slightly move from its face on position, you can pen these areas here on the left and on the right hand side of the vehicle, and that is your best bet. And failing that, if it does manage to get it anywhere near going to angle, which is optimal if you are playing this tank up against other people, where you're kind of angling in this sort of direction. If the opponent is directly in front of you, you kind of want to aim an angle like this, and that's going to give you the best chance. And as you're doing that, you want to give a little bit of a wiggle so that you end up doing this to your vehicle, where you increase the chances of bouncing off that lower plate and also the upper plate. And then they may even aim for this area, and then you quickly swap back and they're going to end up bouncing off of here if they are aiming at this location. And so it just increases your chances of bouncing, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. If it is a case of you need to aim at them, make sure you get shot off. I wouldn't worry about wheeling all too much, and you might just want to angle. And yeah, that is kind of how you can play this tank in terms of its armor, and the side armor is absolute garbage. You can be bent by pretty much every single tank in the game. 50 millimeters, and in fact will get overmatched by a ton of vehicles, anything over 151 millimeters, meaning things like the the 155s or the 15 centimeters may be able to go straight through the side of your vehicle, which, yeah, not particularly too fun. And there are certainly things like the Jaegeru who are going to go straight through this side armor, so just be very aware of what is going to be able to pen you through this side. And of course, this is a big blob of hit points for artillery to actually take you out. So we've seen what the tank can do at its pinnacle. We've seen what the tank is going to be capable of with its armor model, pretty lackluster, to be honest, and probably one of the more worsely armored tank destroyers in the game, I would assume. But it's still very, very powerful, and if you take it into certain positions, like we're going to showcase in these couple of replays here, just where you can take this thing. And of course, if you see this tank in these sorts of positions, just make sure that you don't fall victim to how well this tank can perform. This map, really, really decent one for this tank, since you can sit at the back of the map staying undetected because you're outside the view range of the vehicles by sitting on the railway tracks. You have to be careful of being blind fired, but it allows you to get free shots of damage on the tanks like the 80 phase 1, the Maushan, who are going to be poking this corner. And it's a really nice way of using the 360 millimeters of penetration to get free shots of damage on them, and they really don't have much of a choice when it comes to playing up against you. Unfortunately, a big low roll there, but still showcasing this position for the Ho-Ri 3. If the enemy team are where the 2790 and the IS-4 and the vehicles are pushing from on this other side, you can take this bush position over here, which is very good if you do pull back behind the bush. Unfortunately, Ho-Ri 3 didn't manage to do that in that last shell, but he does then pull back behind the bush to get a free shot of damage on the T124, and now you see him actually pulling right back behind the bush to deal with the 279E, and hopefully using the 360mm of penetration that this tank gets on its premium rounds to be able to remove the 279E using the side of the turret, which is really nice, and picking up over 3000 damage. Now with the enemy team pushing from the center of the map by the buildings, or the workshop, you can see that he's been able to use this position really well, and so not only can you protect from the southern side of the map if the enemy team win it, but you can also protect against the people straight in front of you, like the Malshan who are pushing around the side, as well as the people who are going to push from the right hand side. But you have to be very mindful of when you're going to get spotted and how you're going to be able to deal with remaining undetected without kind of exposing all too much of yourself, and making sure that you aren't getting spotted from the people behind you to the south as of this position right now. And that means that sometimes you're going to have to pull back into the location by the railway tracks, in which you can remain undetected from the people in the south and also get shots on people like the 80 phase 1, but it is quite risky as anyone with decent view range is going to be able to spot you. But in getting into this position, you can use the hold down nature of this vehicle to get some shells into them, and really they're only going to spot you if they are of course within the view range, and the AE phase 1, having not pulled up entirely, is going to struggle with that. But in order to really deal a decent amount of damage and win this game, he does have to shut down that light tank who's making his way towards the artillery, and in doing so allows him now to focus directly on the tanks in front of him like the AE phase 1, and he manages to pull off a lucky shell there. So yeah, some really good nice repositioning to take out a couple of tanks and then deal with flanks individually, and then turn around to deal with the next flank. And that flank is of course the E100, who's pushing through the center, and a lovely shell into him, dealing with him and allowing him to be reduced enough such that his teammates can remove the last remaining hit points off that tank, and they're starting to claw back that hit point advantage. Once again, using the repositioning of this tank to get up into the bushes over here to get some shells onto the T124, who managed to spot the Leopard PTA and remove him, which is a little bit unfortunate, but with a little bit of assistance from artillery and of course keeping this guy lit up, he's able to be removed, and that allows him now to get into a 2 versus 5 scenario with the artillery, the FV4005, the Malshan, the TL7 and the IS4 on the enemy team. And luckily he manages to hit the Malshan in the turret using the good accuracy that the tank gets of 0.33, shuts him down, and manages to now outspot the IS4 and be able to use the 400 meters of base view range that this tank gets to be able to get another free shot into the IS4 before he goes undetected. And now it's time to push up through these bushes to avoid being detected, and also try and spot for the T92 against this IS4. And having done 7,700 damage, you can see the influence of using these bushes right here, and then moving to the railway tracks and moving back to these bushes can be a pivotal role in defending from this side and just increasing the overall damage you can get in the late game, even if you don't manage to win outright. Now the FV4005 makes the aggressive push, and unfortunately for him, a round coming from the Hori 3 manages to connect with the turret of the 4005, shutting him down, and now it's just a case of trying to find those tanks still remaining like the IS4, and of course that artillery piece along with the TL7. And the IS4 gets spotted. He lands around straight into the upper plate by the looks of it. As you can see, the armor model not working as you'd expect from things like a Jaegeru, but still able to at least get a shell of damage in return. And you can see there, even when you take a shell from a tier 10 heavy tank like the IS4, maybe not the E100, you can still come out on top because you have that hit point or damage advantage over a lot of those tier 10 heavies. Now, having removed the IS4 and with just a small amount of time left on the clock, the Object 261 does get spotted, and there's a TO7 left alive, but with only 45 seconds now left in the game, and you're having to deal damage every 15 seconds base reload with this vehicle. You have to get there really quickly to deal at least 2 shells of damage before the game ends. And with the speed of this tank not being the best or the greatest in the game, you do really have to charge forward. And you can see here, aiming fully into that cupola of the TO7, lands 1, but now he really does need to push forward, because if he does miss this next shell, if he bounces this next shell, it's going to be a draw. But instead, he decides to ram the TO7 to deal a little bit of damage, securing a easy kill on the TO7 and winning the game for 11,500 damage. A brilliant result in this vehicle, and certainly a good showcase of various different positions on this map. This next replay is going to show once again the Hurry in a few different spots, and we're going to hopefully give you an idea as to how you can use this tank on another map, Abbey. And Abbey is one of those maps which is typically a little bit of a campy one for some of the tank destroyers, but you're going to see a variety of different styles of gameplay, as we've said, within this one. Now the first spot is of course taking our way over to the eastern side of the map and getting up against these bushes, which allow you to remain undetected, at least if you do sit behind them. But as soon as things like the EBR can get forward and they get into the middle position like you're seeing here on the map, they're able to spot you, and they're going to spot you every single time you fire, so you have to be a little bit careful, especially up against those tanks like the Jaeger. Like once we say, if they catch the side armor of this thing, they're going to auto pen you, and even if they don't manage to catch the side armor, because of that high penetration that those TDs have, they're just going to go straight through the front of this tank like butter. So just be very careful when you are poking up against things like the enemy tank destroyers, since yeah, they really are not going to have any trouble penning you. But as you can see, been able with his team to be removing a lot of these tanks like the Jaeger, like the 268 version 4, the 140 and the EBR from this flank, and that is going to be one of the best things that he can do, since the enemy team are pushing the western side of the map, and he's going to have to really deal with them in a little bit. Now the EBR 105 does get spotted, which is really crucial, since that was the thing that was going to be able to allow the enemy team to counter some of the TDs right here. But unfortunately no one seemed to have been able to actually hit the EBR 105, and with the Manticore not actually spotting this side other than things like the E4 and of course some of the other TDs that are camping in the back, he's not able to really deal damage to him and remain undetected. Although at this current moment in time, outside of the render range of a lot of these tanks, which means he's pretty safe and not really going to get spotted unless of course the EBR then moves up. And when you are in this position right here, you do sacrifice or potentially end up in a little bit of a sticky situation against things that can push up in the center. And if they do push up in the center like the AMX-50B, they can get a bit of a crossfire on you from that area if you do push up to where the Action X is, so you just have to be a little bit careful when pushing this side. But having seen where the enemy team are deploying with the Jaeger pushing down the central channel, and when you've got an E100, a Leopard 1 and an AMX M4 along with another E100 pushing the other side, you really do need to make sure to at least provide some defensive support against them. And if you can do that, you're going to be able to secure the base from enemies just pushing straight into you, as well as give yourself some opportunity to get some shots into that Jaeger who is pushing down that central channel, and at least provide some support to your team. And you can see here, unfortunately not able to connect the shell before the friendly teammates do on that Leopard 1, but either way probably would have been able to hit him regardless. But gets himself into this nice position. You can get some shells on to the E100s as they cross into that location, but with the 279E, who's going to be able to bounce a few shells, and with the enemy team kind of pushing down, he's able to protect him a little bit, and he shuts down the enemy T110E5, providing some cover for the 279E. Not that that tank really needs any, but either way really does help him out here. And now it's just an E100, and hopefully he can hit the lower plate. Yes, he can, with the 0.33 accuracy. So moving into this position after knowing that the enemy team are going to win this western side of the map is a good way way of defending and can get you some free shots of damage that I highly recommend, especially if you are winning the eastern side of the map. And actually knowing to turn around and help out your team is going to yield you with 10 times more damage than you would expect from just trying to push against the hidden TDs that are of course sat there waiting for you to get spotted, and then you're going to lose a load of hit points and of course not come out with the best result that you possibly can, and you're probably not going to win if you let your base be capped out by a load of enemy tanks like the T100LT, the E100s and the EBR105 who's over on this side now. Now this T100LT is proving to be a real nuisance, since when you're in this position normally you can use the bushes directly in front of you to remain hidden, but because when he tries to poke around and use those bushes against these tanks that are going to be like the E100, the T100 gets a free kind of vision line against you through this bush right here, and that allows you to get spotted every single time. So it's kind of disappointing, but either way he decides, you know what, there's no point in pushing this corner since I am going to get spotted every time, so let's help out on this other area against the 50B and things like that. But now knowing that the E100 is of course pushing, and with a little peek of the T100LT he's able to connect one, but he does take a big old E100 hit in return, and now it's time to pull back and hopefully be able to get at least one more shell before he's removed. And indeed with another shell into the E100. Now knowing that the E100 is now taken out from being able to easily hit him, he has to deal with this side, and if you are in this sort of position you should be doing the same, taking out the tanks that are now pushing through the center. And he luckily bounces one off of the 268 version 4. He obviously hit the really well angled upper plate because he was over rotated, and that allows for a little bit of a bounce. Now he then shuts down the 268 version 4, perfect, but he does now have one of the most annoying tanks pushing him, which is the Object 430U, and having done 7,400 damage against a whole host of opponents and having relocated to try and give his team the biggest chances of winning, it is not looking all too good. But the 430U makes the biggest misplay, which is bouncing off this tank, and unfortunately for him he does meet the Progetto 65 and the Minotauro, who help out the Hori 3 and allow him to survive to the next stage of the battle. Now with the Progetto escaping, he does of course pre-aim at that E4 who's going to be making his way through this location. Now unfortunately, because of the size of this vehicle, you're not able to realistically get easy shells using the bushes and remain undetected, so you have to be a little bit wary because of the fact that this tank is huge and you aren't going to be able to kind of get into those small positions. And also you have to be wary because if a tank blind fires you like you'd expect, if this tank has spotted you once and gets into that location, it's probably going to get you again. But unfortunately for both of the enemy tanks here, he actually ends up managing to bounce one off of the back from the EBR105, who was obviously a little bit trigger happy, and he shuts him down as well as bouncing one from the E4. So a almost perfect result there. I mean, bit lucky, but he still will take it, and take it he does. And that means that now there is an E100 that still needs to be taken out, and he is indeed a one shot. And the E4 is also on low hit points, and hopefully he's able to get some shots onto him. But the Progetto 65 manages to bounce 2 rounds on the E4, which is not ideal, and now the E4 is starting to move towards him, which means that he is going to have to push towards that E4 and hopefully get a shot onto him. The E4 then comes outside on, and he helps out his teammate there, so removing that 589 hit points remaining, and that means that there is only an E100 left on 941 hit points. So in this sort of position, the key thing that you do is not trying to crest the ridgeline. See, most people in this sort of spot would be thinking, you know what, I'm just going to crest here. Now if you do that, what can happen is that E100, if he's cresting over here, can spot you, and if you get spotted, if for example there were multiple tanks on the enemy team, they're going to be able to hit you from the left hand side where that E4 was, if there is someone still left alive. In this game, not the case, but Instead, he moves up to the bushes, which grants him some camo, which allows him to outspot anything that's going to be pushing up here, since there are no bushes on the enemy side that the E100 can sit behind without actually being able to get spotted from. So that's really nice. Nice little check to see if the E100 is indeed pushing, rather than just cresting that ridgeline and potentially getting flicked onto by that E100, which is of course not going to be the best result. But he does actually manage to find out where this E100 is. He is of course pushing and does exactly what we just saw there. Rather than sitting up on that ridgeline, decides he's going to go back into the bush area, and this is a really pivotal area of the map in these losing games, or the losing games where you think that you have basically lost, but you can pull games back really nicely from this position and come away with a win. Once again, pulls up into this location, pushes through the bushes to spot the E100, pulls back behind them, gets a free shot on the E100. He's now looking at where the Ho-Re's just hit him from. He's now going to be forced by the Projecto 65 in the side, and yes, an easy crossfire created by both the Ho-Re and the Projecto 65 to come away with a win. And hopefully that's given you an indication that this tank can be a little bit of a monster, and in the right hands with the right sort of playstyle, this tank can certainly be capable of dealing more damage than the Jaeger and be a little bit more consistent than the Jaeger, I think, just because it's just that little bit more flexible in my opinion. But I'd be interested to see what you guys think of the new Japanese TDs, and most especially the tier 10 Japanese tank destroyer, this one right here. But other than that, hopefully you join me in the next video coming soon, and subscribe to the channel if you're not already,